Good morning. So I want to make a record of how the god El became the god El, which became the god of the Israelites, and became associated with what it's associated with, um, first by the Greeks and others. And I want to make a record of this because it's important to know the meanings of words so that you can understand civilization. One of the reasons why Western civilization hasn't perpetuated itself is because nobody knows anything about it. They're totally confused about it. They don't know where anything came from or what anything means. So how could you perpetuate something when you have no idea what it is? So yeah, okay. So this is what I did. So this morning, because I've been reading a lot of the early creation myths, the Sumerian and the Akkadian, and I believe there's an Assyrian version, which is a good version of the lost Sumerian version. Now, in the Sumerian Pantheon, the original Sumerian Pantheon, you have the god Enlil, who was the chief god of the Sumerian Pantheon. He was like the god of the gods. And he was a god associated with storms. So he was the storm god. Now, it's very interesting because when you go back and you start looking at all of the powers of the ancient world in Sumeria and among the Amorites, the Hebrews, the Hebrews were very into the storm god. There's different names for the storm god, and I don't want to go through all the names. I believe Hadad is one of the names, and the city in Iraq, Baghdad, it's actually Baghdad, and that refers to a storm god. The storm god was the thing, especially among the military orders, because they were like a storm, right? Your military was like a storm that would come through, and like a storm front would wipe out your enemies, and then that's why the storm. That's why the military orders tended to worship the storm god as the primary god. And the storm god controls what? When there's a storm, the storm god controls the water, right? The storm god is pushing around the ocean and pushing around clouds that are causing the rain and blocking out the sun. So and it's the storm god and his winds that cause the ocean waves and cause the storms to rain on the fields and bring new life. So he's very important as far as his role in everything, right? And then because the militaries would come through like a storm, that was how they identified themselves with the storm god. So we got to look at names and etymology, right? So what is the name of the storm god? The name of the storm god is Enlil, which means En is God and Lil appears to refer to the winds and the storm. So Enlil is the god of the storm. Now, over time, that name changed to El-Lil, meaning God of the storm. So El is God, Lil refers to the storm. So Enlil became El-Lil. Now, what it says in Wikipedia is that later on, things are changing because you have shifts in power of different cultures, right? And so you have, later on, you have a synchronization. But I think what happened is when the Sumerians lost power to another race called the Elamites, they began to worship Marduk as the supreme god, and put Marduk as the role of the supreme god, which is really he's a symbol of the sun. So the sun was not originally the primary god of the ancient world as far as a chief deity. He became the chief deity when the Sumerians actually lost power. And if you look through all the ancient cults of the Middle East, whether it's the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Aryans, down into at the time when the Amorite or Akkadian races, the Hyksos kings of Egypt, they worship Set who was a desert god, but was much like a storm god too. So it seemed like the storm god was the thing. It was the thing among this race of people that spread through the Fertile Crescent and down into Egypt, but not the Egyptians. And that comes to another point, which is the philosophy in the Bible, is it more Egyptian or is it more Sumerian? And that's an interesting question because racially, it's Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian. That's the race of these people, right? But philosophically, it became more Egyptian. Now, I'm not an atheist, and so I believe that there is a creator God, which is a spirit, and that every human being has a soul, which is eternal. And so this spirit God is in humanity. The spirit God, this eternal, this non-material entity, is the God of the creator God, who is also the God of the human soul. So now, but this idea does not come from the Sumerians, and it does not come from the Akkadians and the Babylonian races. This whole philosophy of the God of the human soul is foreign to their creation story. It really is. Their creation story is very materialistic. Very materialistic. The difference is that in Egypt you had a creating power which then became symbolized as the sun. So when you have Atum Ra, right? Atum would be like the creative power behind Ra, or Amun Ra would be this invisible god, which is the power which materializes as Ra. It's not the same thing as the Sumerian and Babylonian races. The Sumerian and Babylonian creation story is absolutely materialistic. It's as materialistic as any atheist evolution theory that you can imagine. There's nothing spiritual about it. It's a bunch of different natural phenomena mixing together to produce life. It totally leaves out the idea of a spiritual dimension, which does exist in the Egyptian and which was written into the Bible. Because what is the Bible? It's a synthesis of two primary races and philosophies, one coming from the Babylonian and the other one coming from Egypt and merging in this location of Judea. So now when we look at the name El, though, so we're going to look at El Enlil is, when you read Genesis, which I just started to read, and it tells you that the whole story starts with a wind over the deep, a wind over these the abyss, which is the ocean, this abyss called the ocean. So it starts with a wind across there, and then light appearing and separating the waters from the water. This is all a merger of essentially two philosophies: the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. We want to call it. Let's call it the Babylonian creation myth and the Egyptian creation story. But they're not the same. That's why it's a synthesis of both, because they're not the same story. But the important thing to understand is what is this God that they're referring to, and how did it become associated with the God of the human soul? Because it didn't start out that way. And so the stories that are the foundation of the stories are not based on the God of the human soul. They're based on evolutionary natural phenomena. So what happened? First of all, how did this god Enlil, who become Enlil, became associated with the sun among the Greeks? Because they started to call, you got to understand, the Greeks started to call El Helio. El and Helio. And Helio is the sun in Greek. So this god that started out, here's the important thing I'm trying to tell you. The chief god of the Sumerian and Babylonian Pantheon started out as a storm god, because the storms control the wind, the air, they control the water that's being pushed around, they're bringing the rain, they're moving the oceans and the seas, It's the wind doing that, and it's the god of that wind who's causing all that, really bringing life to the desert, and causing the rain flow, and everything is caused by the storm god. So that's if you look at natural phenomena, but as far as a science, that would be the most important deity of all the deities, would be the storm god. More important than Ishtar, right? Because Ishtar is just a pretty star, and the moon is just like, a pretty, like a clock. So those are important too. But the storm god was really important because it was bringing life to the soil. Okay, but his name was Enlil, god of the storm. He became Enlil, meaning god of the storm, because now they're calling it El. Well, who's calling it El? The Babylonians are calling it El. The Greeks then, because what happened, somewhere it became the storm god, it became associated with the sun, because the Greeks are later calling it Helio, meaning El, and they're practicing, they're reading from Enuma Elish. The Romans are reading from Enuma Elish with what was his name? Elagabalus, I think that was his name, or Heliogabalus. He was a Roman of what they call Syrian descent. Don't know exactly. You're gonna have to look that up. I'm just going off memory here. So, but they were reading from Enuma Elish, which has Marduk as the chief deity, because what happened is you had Enlil, who was the storm god, and all the Middle East was about the storm god. Then, I believe it was when the Elamites conquered the territory, the Marduk became the chief deity, and you had a synchronization occur where Enlil and Marduk and maybe some other god all became synchronized as one deity. So now they've changed the story, and they've put this new deity called Bel, referring to Bel Marduk. And of course, now it's all associated with the sun. It's no longer associated with the storms. It's now associated with the sun. And it's associated with the sun. It's associated with the springtime and the vernal equinox and, Orion and Taurus right next to each other, because that's important. So there's a shift there between the worship of the storm god that was worshipped throughout all the Middle East. When you go back and you look at these stories, for instance, of the Haparu, the Hebrews, and among the like, for instance, in the Egyptian Amarna letters, they're all worshiping the storm god still. They kept worshiping the storm god for a really long time throughout all these different changes in these religions. The storm gods maintained this primary status among the warriors, particularly, I believe. I think it was the warriors in particular, including the Hebrews. The Hebrews were worshiping the storm god way, way, way later. So, at some point, a lot of things changed, and they started to identify with the sun god, with Marduk and the sun god, and a synchronization of the gods took place. And because of the Egyptian control over the territory and the bringing in of an Egyptian system into Canaan with the new kingdom, with Amos and his god Amen. Because what are people saying at the end of their prayers? They're saying Amen. It's the Christians and the Jews say Amen at the end of their prayers too. I don't know about the Islamics, but Amen became an important figure in the theology, and Amen was the hidden god. He was like this invisible god who became the chief god of the Pantheon in Egypt when you had this New Kingdom period. So everything was Amen. Everything was about Amen and Amen Ra versus Atum Ra, which it had been previously. So that was Amen, and he was an invisible god. He was an unseen god, which is much like what's described in the Bible. And so you had a real synchronization of these different gods. Now, you have this other figure, which is you have this tribe called the Yahuwah tribe, Yahuwah, the Yahuwah tribe, among these different tribes over there in the Sinai Canaanite territory, probably close to Edom. You had this Yahuwah tribe. And so the Yahuwah tribe, now you think, well, what was the god of the Yahuwah tribe? Likely a storm god. Likely a storm god. Yahu was likely a storm god. I would most likely assume that it was a storm god, that it was a desert god, because when you look at who the Hyksos rulers identified with, they identified with Set, not with Horus, but with Set, the storm god. That was the god that the Hyksos most closely identified to as their god, which was most similar to the rest of Canaan and Syria and Babylon before the rise of Marduk. So Set is the Egyptian form of Hadad and is the Egyptian form of Enlil, would have been the primary god. And so if you think of like who would have been the primary god of these people out there, the Yahuwah, it's hard to say. There's no record of it. It's all speculation. It's all speculation. But I would say probably a storm god, since that was the popular thing at the time. Before the sun god, it was the storm god was the thing, particularly among military orders. Not so much in Egypt. The Egyptians had a different system. So that's where we come to the synchronization. And so at some point there were too many gods, and that's why the Judeans and the other people associated with them in the land of Canaan went with the creator god, the god of the human soul, later. It started out as the creator of the universe god, and then later became associated with the human soul. Seems like that happened more during the Greek period than it did originally. It didn't seem like there. If when you read Genesis through, well, there is a bit of. I shouldn't say there's nothing there. There is, particularly all the way going back to, well, when you read the Sumerian creation story of he's called Ziasutra, or he's also called Atrahasis. Okay, Atrahasis or Ziasutra, or both Noah figures. They do listen to this god Enki, who tells them what to do, and they listen to their god. So, but it's not a spiritual thing. There's nothing spiritual about it. And then that's what I used to wonder about with the Bible, is it's not there is some more spirituality in the Bible, and it's kind of infused in there in a later period, but the origins of it aren't. And you can see that when you're reading it. It's not really about the human soul. It does become more about that, though, at some point. I believe what happened is that because of the interaction between the Judeans and the Egyptians and the Greeks, that there became more of an emphasis on the human soul, and writing that into these old stories from these ancient Sumerian stories. That's where the change happened, is that there became more of an emphasis on reading the human soul aspect, the god of the human soul, into these stories, which did not originally have anything to do with these stories. And I think that was the big changeover from worshiping idols and worshiping false gods as natural phenomena to then dramatically going in this other direction. Now, these gods weren't really false gods because they're natural phenomena, so they do exist. They're not gods, they're just natural phenomena, which as they exist as powers in nature. But it's not. But when you start to think of yourself as a human soul, those things become not very important. So you wouldn't worship them the same way you would if you're a materialistic person. And so I think that's kind of where the change happened. So etymologically, what happened? You had Enlil, who became Elil, who then got synchronized at some point with Marduk and maybe some other gods. What does it say it says the synchronization of, well, I can't see it here. Oh, here we go. It says his cult fell into decline after Nippur was sacked by the Elamites 1230 BC, and he was eventually supplanted by the chief god of the Mesopotamian Pantheon by the Babylonian national god Marduk. Babylonian god Bel was a synchronitic deity of Enlil, Marduk, and the shepherd deity Dumuzi. That's the other one I left out, Dumuzi. Dumuzi and Marduk are really very similar in that they're both associated with nature. They're both associated with springtime, the resurrection of spring, which is what we celebrate on Easter with Jesus. So anyway, that's kind of how Enlil, who was a storm god, became a sun god, and then later became the god of the human soul.